Has CNN or BBC told you about the billions of dollars worth of oil discovered in South Africa? Why would they? When the West is planning to steal that, why would the Western media talk about it? While Africa is getting stronger with each passing day, it is becoming more prone to exploitation. With success, Africa is finding more opportunities, including oil discovery. But as soon as the news was shared, the Western officials were ready to make some deal with South Africa. They are ready to
already invested $13 billion into this pipeline. And guess what, guys? After the Nord Stream pipeline destruction, Chevron stepped up production to get this up and running. Hey, we'll speed this up. We'll fast track this. And now the people of Niger are saying, wait a second, why are we going to allow a pipeline to flow right through our country so Europe can have natural gas? You are doing nothing for us. You continue to steal from us. Sorry, no more pipeline. This is why Europe is terrified.
The East African country of Rwanda might just be the next oil-producing nation in Africa. Rwanda has indicated a potential oil discovery in the country. During a parliamentary hearing, the CEO of the Rwanda Mines, Petroleum and Gas Board, or the RMB, stated that there are 13 oil wells that have been found in the Lake Kivu region. The lake has a history of volcanic eruptions and is known to contain large amounts of dissolved gas.
Western nations pledged to fund Uganda's development and construction of one of the largest oil pipelines. With a $5 billion budget, it was known as the East African Crude Oil Pipeline. The US was supposed to handle all the investments so that Tanzania, which has access to the Indian Ocean, could receive Uganda's crude oil. Uganda's economy may be boosted by billions of dollars if the crude oil were to reach the entire world.
Western media has slammed the Uganda-Tanzania joint crude oil pipeline project, which could relieve the impact of the energy crisis on Africa, with the EU accusing Uganda and Tanzania of human rights violations and climate pollution. The pipeline, at around 1,500 kilometers long, would help utilize Uganda's massive oil reserves and also supply other countries through the port in neighboring Tanzania, helping to return oil prices.
Did you know that deep under western Uganda lies one of Africa's most talked about energy discoveries? Oil. A story that's been years in the making and could transform the region. The oil fields sit in the Albertine Graben, stretching along Lake Albert. Discovered in the early 2000s, Uganda's proven reserves are estimated to be over 6.5 billion barrels, with at least 1.4 billion of these.
Africa's going to be a very wealthy continent. Give it a few more years. It's going to be the breadbasket of the world as well. I mean, the amount of stories coming out, I've never seen any of these stories in the American media, and I'm just like overwhelmed, like, whoa, look at this. There's a new pipeline going in. They're building new refineries. This is another thing. These investment projects coming in from China and Russia, they are financing a dozen at least new refineries. Now, 2 of them are very near completion right now, which means the old way was multinational companies, I'm not going to say individual nation, there's many operating there, would basically steal the oil on pennies on the dollar from Nigeria.
African Americans built this nation. We built this nation. You know, you're just starting to get real credit for that. Okay, I don't know if you know that. You're just starting to get, you built the nation. We all built it, but you were such a massive part of it. Bigger than you were given credit for. Does that make sense? Right? But through generations of blood, sweat, and tears, and you deserve a government that defends your interests, protects your families, and cares for our own citizens first. My administration is fighting with everyone and all our heart to reverse the pain inflicted by Democrat leaders and to deliver hope and opportunity and prosperity for all Americans, but for African American communities all throughout our land.
The first signs of the crisis began quietly, almost too quietly for the world to notice. A series of diplomatic meetings across African capitals hinted at something unusual, but global markets brushed them off as routine discussions. Yet behind closed doors, African leaders were recalibrating the continent's most powerful weapon, its oil. Africa supplied a massive portion of the world's crude, especially 2 nations that rarely acknowledged the continent's importance. Among them, the United States stood out. For decades, Washington had assumed that Africa would always remain a dependable, ever-available supplier. American energy companies operated under the belief that disruptions in the Middle East or political tensions in Eastern Europe posed the greatest risks. Africa, they believed, would always prioritize selling its oil to Western markets, but they were wrong. In Abuja, Luanda, Tripoli, Algiers, Accra, and other capitals, a new consensus had formed. Africa was tired of selling its most valuable resource at a discount, tired of exporting rock crude while importing refined fuel at exorbitant prices, tired of watching prosperity flow outward while poverty persisted at home. And above all, the continent was tired of being told how to run its own industries. The catalyst came when the African Energy Council announced a sweeping decision. Major oil-producing nations across the continent would be halting crude shipments to the United States. Not reducing, not suspending, temporarily halting indefinitely. The official explanation was concise and unapologetic. Africa needed to redirect its oil to new refining projects, regional energy strategies, and emerging partnerships with Asia and South America. The continent was reorganizing its energy future, and the age of automatic access for the U.S. was over. The reaction was immediate. Oil markets convulsed violently. Prices spiked within hours. Energy traders panicked. American officials scrambled for explanations, insisting the move was a misunderstanding. But it was not. The African embargo was real, coordinated, and executed with a level of unity the world had not expected. American news outlets broke the story with panicked urgency. Analysts warned that the cutoff threatened to trigger the worst energy crisis the country had seen in decades. Stocks stumbled as oil futures soared past thresholds economists had long considered impossible. The U.S. government activated emergency reserves, but even that could not mask the scale of the blow. Africa supplied more than oil. It supplied stability. Without African oil, the balance collapsed. In Washington, emergency meetings stacked one after another. Officials assured the public that alternatives existed, but behind the scenes they knew the situation was dire. Middle Eastern producers were already bound by long-term commitments, and tensions in the region had limited their export flexibility. Latin American producers could not ramp up production quickly enough. Canada was reaching maximum capacity, and alternative fuels, while promising for the future, could not fill the immediate gap. The U.S. needed Africa, but Africa no longer needed the U.S. In Lagos, a press conference drew the attention of the entire world. African representatives outlined the deeper motivations behind the cutoff. For decades, crude oil left African shores with minimal processing, while refined fuel returned at several times the cost. The continent subsidized foreign industries at the expense of its own. The embargo was not retaliation. It was emancipation. Africa was shifting toward refining its own oil, strengthening regional trade agreements, and building an economy centered on self-reliance. New refinery projects had sprung up across West and Central Africa, funded by partnerships with the Gulf, China, and India. African nations were developing petrochemical industries, expanding natural gas infrastructure, and moving toward creating an African energy exchange that would allow the continent to set its own prices. For the first time, African oil producers were moving away from dependency and toward dominance. The United States, accustomed to dictating terms, found itself suddenly powerless. Negotiators traveled across African capitals, seeking exemptions, temporary relief, or partial reinstatement of trade routes. But the continent remained united. The embargo would remain until the U.S. accepted new trade conditions, fair pricing structures, support for African industrialization, respect for national sovereignty, and the end of exploitative contracts. American officials balked at the demands. Accepting them would mean acknowledging Africa as an equal economic power, a reality Washington had resisted for decades. But the consequences of refusal mounted swiftly. Gas prices across the U.S. soared. Trucking companies faced bankruptcy as fuel costs doubled. Airlines raised ticket prices, cut routes, and grounded aircraft. Manufacturers dependent on diesel and petroleum-based chemicals experienced unprecedented disruptions. The cost of transporting goods skyrocketed, triggering inflation across multiple sectors. In major cities, the impact became palpable. Store shelves saw sporadic shortages as supply chains struggled to adapt. Food distribution centers faced rising transportation costs, pushing prices higher. The cost of electricity surged in regions dependent on oil-fired power plants. Politicians warned that the nation faced a $180 billion energy shock, with the potential to ripple across all levels of society. Meanwhile, Africa experienced a transformation unlike anything in its history, without the constant drain of crude flowing. Outward, new industrial zones emerged. Coastal cities expanded their refining capacities, creating thousands of jobs. Local economies strengthened as oil wealth circulated within African borders. Energy independence empowered African nations to invest in infrastructure, renewable power, education, and manufacturing. In Angola and Nigeria, petrochemical plants processed products once imported from abroad. In Algeria and Libya, natural gas pipelines expanded further across the continent, powering industries that were once entirely reliant on foreign fuel. Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Equatorial Guinea invested heavily in offshore technology and renewables, positioning themselves as leaders in the global energy transition. Africa was not retreating into isolation, it was rising. In Beijing, New Delhi, Riyadh, and leaders observed the shift with keen interest. Africa's bold move aligned with the growing trend of nations rejecting outdated global hierarchies. Partnerships deepened quickly. China offered technology for advanced refineries. India negotiated long-term contracts with African suppliers. The Gulf states invested in African infrastructure, seeking mutual growth rather than dominance, and South American countries, long subjected to similar patterns of exploitation, applauded Africa's stand. The global balance of power shifted palpably. The world saw that Africa was no longer a secondary player in energy politics. It was a central force capable of influencing global markets, reshaping supply chains, and determining the direction of future economic alignments. As the crisis deepened, American media shifted their tone. What began as outrage became reluctant acknowledgement. Economists debated where the country had gone wrong. Some argued that the U.S. had underestimated Africa for too long, believing the continent would forever remain a pliant supplier. Others claimed Washington should have built stronger partnerships before the crisis erupted. But a growing number admitted a more painful truth. The U.S. had viewed Africa through outdated assumptions, failing to recognize the continent's rising economic ambitions. In Houston and other energy hubs, the industry faced a reckoning. Refineries designed to process African crude struggled to adapt to new suppliers with vastly different compositions. Retrofitting equipment cost billions and required months of downtime. Oil companies slashed dividends and laid off employees. Workers protested outside corporate offices, demanding accountability. The American trucking sector suffered most acutely. Diesel prices skyrocketed, crippling logistics networks. Small trucking companies shut down. Large ones passed the cost to consumers, sparking inflation in everything from groceries to construction materials. The American economy felt the pressure at every level, from households to multi-billion-dollar corporations. In Congress, debates erupted with furious intensity. Some demanded retaliation against Africa, arguing that the U.S. could not allow a continent to dictate terms. But others recognized that retaliation would only deepen the crisis. Africa's alliances were too broad, its economic networks too diverse. Punishing Africa would isolate the U.S. further and push African nations even closer to global competitors. Eventually, the United States reached a sobering realization. The crisis could only end through negotiation, real negotiation, not demands disguised as diplomacy. American representatives traveled once more to Addis Ababa, where the African Union hosted a summit designed to redefine the future of energy relations. This time, the tone was different. Gone was the posture of superiority. Gone was the assumption of automatic access. Instead, the U.S. approached the table with humility, acknowledging that global leadership required cooperation, not dominance. Africa listened. The continent had no interest in crippling the U.S. permanently. Its goal was not revenge but respect. African nations insisted that any new agreements must support African industrialization, ensure fair pricing, protect resource sovereignty, and establish long-term investment in Africa's refining and energy infrastructure. For the first time, the United States agreed. In the months that followed, a new era of trade emerged. The U.S. invested in African oil refineries and renewable projects, not as an overseer but as a partner. African energy companies gained unprecedented access to American markets. Technology transfer programs expanded. Joint ventures flourished across both continents. The crisis did not end overnight, but it transformed into opportunity. The $180 billion economic shock became a lesson etched deep into policy circles. the United States, learned that energy security could no longer rely on dominance. It required balance, respect, and mutual benefit, and Africa emerged from the crisis stronger, more united, and more confident than ever. For generations, the continent had been defined by what others took from it. Now it was defined by what it chose to protect. The world witnessed an extraordinary shift. Africa no longer stood at the edges of global power. Africa shaped it. The shock that unfolded across global markets did not fade with time. Instead, it deepened like a widening fault line splitting the foundations of the world economy. As Africa's coordinated oil cutoff dragged into its third month, the United States realized the turbulence was not a temporary price spike nor a passing geopolitical quarrel. It was the beginning of a structural reconfiguration, one that threatened to permanently shift the balance of energy power away from Washington and into the hands of nations long overlooked by the global system. Inside the United States, pressure intensified as the cost of living surged, airlines slashed routes, manufacturing plants reduced operating hours, and port facilities reported their lowest freight volumes in years. Energy companies that once relied heavily on affordable African crude scrambled to secure alternative sources, but many found themselves outbid by Asian and Middle Eastern buyers. Storage facilities that were once comfortably stocked now operated on razor-thin reserves. Africa, meanwhile, approached the global spotlight with newfound confidence. Nations that once depended on exporting rock crude to survive had transformed into assertive players dictating the terms of future energy cooperation. Strategic alliances began forming across the continent. West African states coordinated their export policies. Central Africa strengthened infrastructure linking inland production to coastal hubs, and East African nations launched new energy corridors with Asia. This unity was not merely symbolic. Joint regulatory frameworks, harmonized tax incentives, and shared security protocols created an integrated energy market with unprecedented influence. Discussions emerged about setting up a Pan-African Petroleum Board modeled loosely on major global energy alliances, but with distinctly African priorities. Analysts who once dismissed the idea now revised their forecasts, acknowledging that Africa had finally stepped into the arena as a heavyweight capable of shaping global policy. As Africa consolidated its strength, the United States confronted another accelerating issue: the erosion of its global manufacturing advantage. Refineries struggled to maintain stable production. Petrochemical plants reported cascading shortages of feedstock materials. Transportation companies warned of systemic disruptions as fuel prices made long-distance freight prohibitively expensive. Even the defense sector faced complications, with supply chains stretched thin and energy-dependent. Operations forced into budget revisions. Washington attempted to pivot toward domestic shale production, but the response was slow and limited. The infrastructure required massive capital investment, and local opposition in several states slowed project approvals. Environmental regulations blocked rapid expansion, and even where production increased, the cost per barrel remained higher than African crude. Politicians debated emergency subsidies, but economists warned such measures would only mask deeper structural vulnerabilities. China and other Asian nations observed the unfolding crisis closely. Beijing seized the opportunity to strengthen strategic partnerships with African producers, offering infrastructure packages, long-term purchase agreements, and joint development contracts. These deals not only secured China's energy future but also locked in political goodwill across the continent. Many African leaders had not forgotten decades of unequal trade relations with Europe and the United States. The new alliances represented a symbolic as well as economic shift. Europe found itself in an equally precarious position. Although the crisis hit the United States hardest, European industries that relied heavily on African energy experienced severe setbacks. Refinery shutdowns spread across southern Europe, shipping companies rerouted vessels to avoid costly fuel surcharges, and agricultural sectors faced skyrocketing operational expenses. The shock demonstrated to Europe how deeply its prosperity was intertwined with African resources it once considered guaranteed. Amid these global disruptions, Africa expanded its energy diversification strategy. Nations launched ambitious campaigns to develop renewable grids, solar fields, and wind farms. The idea was clear. Africa sought not only to control its fossil fuel destiny but also to become a global hub for affordable clean energy. Investors poured into these initiatives, drawn by the continent's vast natural capacity. This surge in green investment created a powerful additional layer of leverage that Africa had never held before. The crisis reached its peak when the United States realized that even diplomatic appeals were no longer effective. Meetings with African leaders produced polite discussions but no concessions. Africa made its position clear. The era of one-sided energy dependence had ended. Any resumption of oil exports to the U.S. would come with new terms, including revised trade agreements, fair pricing models, and commitments to support African industrialization. What stunned Washington the most was the unity across African capitals. Historically, external powers had exploited regional disagreements, internal crises, or political transitions to maintain influence. But this time, Africa stood as a collective force. Even nations with historically different political alignments aligned under a shared vision of economic sovereignty. This coordinated stance rendered traditional geopolitical strategies ineffective. In the U.S., discussions shifted from how to reverse the crisis to how to adapt to a world where its dominance was no longer assured. Economists warned that without structural reforms, diversification, and diplomatic recalibration, the energy shock could mark the beginning of a long-term decline. A $180 billion setback was only the first tremor. Future disruptions could be far more destabilizing. At the same time, African nations contemplated the broader implications of their newfound influence. The success of the oil cutoff proved that collective action could yield unprecedented leverage. This encouraged discussions in other strategic sectors from minerals to agriculture to technology partnerships. Africa's leaders understood the significance. They had crossed a threshold where they were no longer merely suppliers but negotiators with real bargaining power. The conclusion of the crisis did not come through capitulation, but through negotiated equilibrium. When Washington finally agreed to revise outdated trade structures, support African energy infrastructure, and respect the continent's economic autonomy, Africa slowly reopened its oil flow. But the world that emerged after the crisis was fundamentally different. Global markets no longer treated Africa as a resource appendage but as a central actor shaping the future of energy politics. The United States acknowledged the strategic necessity of equal partnerships. Europe recalibrated its policies to avoid repeating past mistakes. Asia deepened its ties, recognizing Africa as a long-term economic cornerstone, and Africa itself discovered something far more valuable than the revenue from oil, the realization that unity, sovereignty, and strategy could transform the global order. The $180 billion American energy shockwave became a turning point in history, not because of the economic damage it caused, but because it revealed a truth the world had long underestimated. The prosperity of nations once dismissed as peripheral was in fact essential to the functioning of the global system. And when Africa chose to assert that truth, the world could no longer ignore it. The crisis ascended, but the lesson endured. The balance of global power had shifted. And Africa had claimed its place on the world stage not through war or conflict, but through economic strength, strategic unity, and sovereign control of its resources.